For years, this woman had been living with a sore throat that just wouldn't go away. At first, it seemed like nothing serious, just the kind of scratchy feeling you get when you're coming down with a cold. But days turned into weeks, and weeks stretched into months. The discomfort didn't fade. Instead, it dug its claws deeper into her life. Some days, the pain was sharp and stabbing, making it hard to swallow even water. Other times, it was more of a dull ache, lingering in the background like an unwelcome guest who refused to leave. She tried everything she could think of to make it better. Over-the-counter lozenges, check. Herbal teas, done. She avoided spicy foods, cut back on coffee, and even gave up soda because someone told her acidity might be the problem. Her family suggested home remedies: honey mixed with lemon, turmeric, milk before bed, gargling salt water multiple times a day. Nothing worked. If anything, the soreness only grew worse over time. It wasn't just physical pain that wore her down. It was the emotional toll, too. She started dreading social gatherings, because talking for long periods made her throat feel raw and swollen. Conversations became exhausting, and she often found herself withdrawing from friends and coworkers. Even her closest relationships began to suffer. Her partner noticed how irritable she'd become, snapping at little things or zoning out during conversations. It wasn't that she wanted to act that way, it's just that being in constant pain changes you. It chips away at your patience, your energy, and eventually, your spirit. Desperate for answers, she visited doctor after doctor. Each one listened patiently as she described her symptoms but came up with different explanations. One said it was probably acid reflux and handed her a prescription for antacids. Another diagnosed her with allergies and recommended nasal sprays and allergy pills. Yet another insisted it was stress-related and suggested yoga and meditation. She followed their advice faithfully, hoping something would finally click. For brief moments, there was relief, but it never lasted. No matter what she did, the sore throat always came roaring back, stronger than ever. The uncertainty gnawed at her. Was it something she was doing wrong? Could she have prevented this somehow? Or was this just her lot in life, a lifetime sentence of dealing with unrelenting pain? She felt trapped, caught between wanting answers and fearing the worst. What if this was something serious? What if no one could figure it out until it was too late? Despite the growing frustration, she refused to give up. Deep down, she clung to a tiny flicker of hope that someone, somewhere, would know what was wrong. That belief kept her going, even when she felt like screaming in despair. So she kept searching, kept asking questions, kept trying new treatments. She scoured the internet for stories of people with similar problems, looking for clues or solutions she might have missed. And then, one day, a glimmer of possibility appeared, a recommendation from a friend who knew someone whose life had been changed by a particular doctor, a specialist, someone who looked beyond the obvious and dug deeper when others stopped looking. This doctor sounded different, not just another name on a list of failed attempts, but someone who genuinely cared about solving puzzles like hers. With nothing left to lose, she decided to take a chance. She booked an appointment, clinging to the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this would be the turning point she'd been waiting for all these years. The day of the appointment arrived, and she felt a strange mix of hope and skepticism. She had been here before, sitting in yet another doctor's office, explaining the same story to yet another person who might not have any real answers. But something about this visit felt different. Maybe it was the way the receptionist greeted her warmly when she walked in, or the calming atmosphere of the clinic, with its soft lighting and quiet hum of activity. Or maybe it was just the sheer exhaustion of years spent searching for help, leaving her willing to grasp at even the smallest shred of optimism. When she finally stepped into the consultation room, the doctor introduced himself with a calm, steady voice. He didn't rush through pleasantries or jump straight into medical jargon like so many others had done before. Instead, he took his time, asking her to start from the beginning. "Tell me everything," he said gently, leaning forward slightly, as if hanging on her every word. For once, she didn't feel dismissed or brushed aside. She felt heard. She began recounting her long battle with the sore throat, the endless cycle of temporary fixes that never worked, the frustration of seeing specialists who couldn't agree on what was wrong, and the toll it had taken on her life. As she spoke, the doctor nodded thoughtfully, occasionally jotting down notes but mostly just listening. When she finished, there was no quick diagnosis or immediate prescription slip shoved across the desk. Instead, he asked more questions, detailed ones she hadn't expected. "Does the pain change depending on the time of day?" he asked. "Do you notice anything triggering it, like certain foods, weather changes, or stress?" She hesitated, thinking back. Yes. Sometimes the pain seemed worse in the mornings, though she'd always assumed it was because her throat felt dry after sleeping. And yes, cold weather did seem to make it worse. But wasn't that normal for everyone? The doctor didn't dismiss these observations. Instead, he encouraged her to keep sharing no matter how small or insignificant the details seemed. Then came the moment that truly set him apart. He explained that while some conditions are easy to diagnose based on symptoms alone, others require looking deeper. Sometimes, he said, the body gives us subtle signs that we miss unless we dig a little further. With that, he ordered a series of tests, ones she hadn't undergone before. There were imaging scans to get a clearer picture of her throat and vocal cords, blood work to rule out underlying issues, and even a referral to an ENT specialist for additional insights. She left the office feeling cautiously optimistic, though still unsure whether this would lead anywhere. Over the next few days, she couldn't stop thinking about the appointment. Was this doctor really onto something, or was she setting herself up for yet another disappointment? The wait for the test results felt agonizingly long, each day stretching out like an eternity. But unlike previous times, she found herself clinging to the idea that maybe, just maybe, this could be the breakthrough she'd been praying for. Finally, the call came. The doctor's assistant informed her that the results were ready and scheduled a follow-up visit for later that week. Sitting in her car afterward, she stared at the phone in her hand, heart pounding. What would the results show? Would they finally explain why she'd suffered for so long? Or would they leave her right back where she started, with more questions than answers? On the drive home, she tried to steady her breathing, reminding herself not to get too hopeful. After all, she'd been burned by false promises before. But, deep down, a tiny spark of belief flickered inside her, a fragile ember refusing to go out. This doctor was different. His approach, his patience, his willingness to listen, it all felt genuine. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future without constant pain, a future where she could laugh, sing, and talk, without wincing. It was a distant dream, perhaps, but one worth holding on to until she knew for sure. The day of the follow-up appointment arrived, and she could barely contain her nerves. She had spent the past few days replaying every possible scenario in her mind. What if the tests didn't reveal anything? What if this was another dead end, just like all the others? But then again, what if they did find something? The thought alone was enough to make her heart race. As she sat in the waiting room, flipping absent-mindedly through a magazine she wasn't really reading, she noticed how quiet it was. Just the soft hum of the air conditioner and the occasional rustle of papers from the reception desk. It felt surreal, as though time itself had slowed down. When the nurse finally called her name, she stood up quickly, almost too quickly, and followed her into the consultation room. Her palms were sweaty, and she wiped them discreetly on her jeans before taking a seat. The doctor walked in moments later, carrying a folder filled with test results. He greeted her warmly but looked serious as he settled into his chair. For a moment, silence hung in the air, heavy and thick, as he flipped through the pages in front of him. She wanted to ask what he saw, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she waited, holding her breath. Finally, he spoke. "I've gone over everything carefully," he began, his tone measured and calm. "And I think we've found the cause of your sore throat." His voice was steady, but there was something in his expression that made her stomach tighten. Not alarm exactly, but gravity. This wasn't going to be a simple explanation. He explained that the imaging scans had revealed something unusual, a small growth located near her vocal cords. It wasn't cancerous, he assured her immediately, which brought an instant wave of relief. But its position was problematic. The growth pressed against sensitive tissues in her throat, causing chronic irritation and pain. That's why the soreness never went away. It wasn't due to acid reflux, allergies, or stress. It was physical, tangible, and treatable, but not without intervention. As he described the situation, she felt a whirlwind of emotions. Relief, yes, because finally someone had uncovered the root of her suffering. But also anger, at herself for enduring years of pain unnecessarily, at the other doctors who hadn't looked deeper, and even at the randomness of it all. Why her? Why had this happened in the first place? And why had it taken so long to figure out? The doctor seemed to sense her turmoil. "This kind of thing is rare," he said gently. "It's not something most doctors would immediately consider unless they're looking for it specifically. That's why it slipped under the radar for so long." Hearing him say that didn't erase the frustration, but it did soften the edges. A little. At least now she knew. Knowledge, however painful, was better than living in the dark. Next, he laid out the plan moving forward. Surgery would be required to remove the growth safely. While the procedure carried some risks, as any surgery does, he emphasized that it offered the best chance at permanent relief. "Once it's removed, you should start feeling better within days," he said confidently. "No more constant sore throat. No more wondering when or if the pain will ever go away." She listened intently, nodding along as he explained the details of the operation. He answered every question she had, no matter how small or seemingly trivial. Would she need to stay overnight in the hospital? Probably not. Most patients go home the same day. How long would recovery take? A couple of weeks during which she'd need to avoid strenuous activities and give her body time to heal. Could complications arise? Yes. But they were rare, and he and his team would monitor her closely throughout the process. By the end of the conversation, she felt a strange mix of emotions. Fear, obviously. Surgery is never something to take lightly. But also hope. Real, tangible hope. For the first time in years, she could envision a future where she wasn't held hostage by pain, where she could wake up in the morning without dreading the inevitable discomfort that awaited her, where she could laugh, sing, or simply talk without wincing. The idea felt almost foreign, like a distant dream she hadn't dared to believe in. Still, doubts lingered. What if something went wrong during the surgery? What if the pain came back afterward? What if this was all too good to be true? She pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the fact that she finally had answers, and a clear path forward. After years of searching, questioning, and suffering, she was ready to take the next step. Whatever happened, at least she wouldn't have to face it blindly anymore. The days leading up to the surgery were a blur of emotions. On one hand, she felt a sense of relief. Finally, there was a plan in place, and someone had taken her pain seriously enough to find a solution. But on the other hand, anxiety crept in like an unwelcome shadow. Surgery, no matter how routine it might seem to others, was still a big deal. The thought of going under anesthesia, of entrusting her body to a team of doctors and nurses, left her feeling vulnerable. What if something went wrong? What if the growth wasn't completely removed, or worse, what if the procedure caused new problems? She tried to distract herself by focusing on practical things. She stocked up on soft foods like yogurt, mashed potatoes, and smoothies, knowing she wouldn't be able to eat anything rough for a while after the surgery. She arranged for her partner to take time off work so he could drive her home from the hospital and help out during those first few days of recovery. She even made a playlist of calming music, hoping it would ease her nerves before the big day. But despite these preparations, sleep didn't come easily. Every night as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind raced with what-ifs. The morning of the surgery arrived, and she woke up earlier than usual, her stomach churning, with nervous energy. She showered slowly, trying to keep her breathing steady, and dressed in comfortable clothes. As she sipped a cup of tea, the last thing she'd be allowed to have before fasting began, she glanced at herself in the mirror. Her reflection looked tired but determined. Today was the day she'd been waiting for, the day that could change everything. When she arrived at the hospital, the atmosphere was calm yet busy. Nurses moved briskly down the hallways, their shoes squeaking against the polished floors. The receptionist greeted her with a warm smile and guided her through the check-in process. Before long, she was led to a private room where a nurse helped her change into a hospital gown. The fabric felt cold against her skin, a stark reminder of where she was and why she was there. A wave of fear washed over her, but she pushed it aside, reminding herself that this was her chance to reclaim her life. A short while later, the anesthesiologist came in to explain what would happen once she was wheeled into the operating room. He spoke in a soothing tone, answering her questions patiently and assuring her that she'd feel nothing during the procedure. "You'll drift off peacefully," he said, "and when you wake up, it'll all be over." His words brought some comfort, though they couldn't fully silence the voice of doubt whispering in the back of her mind. Finally, it was time. The nurse wheeled her bed down the hallway toward the operating room, the fluorescent lights overhead casting a pale glow. Her heart pounded in her chest as she caught glimpses of the surgical team preparing for her arrival. They wore scrubs and masks, their movements precise and efficient. One of them gave her a thumbs up and said, "We've got you," which made her chuckle nervously despite herself. As they transferred her onto the operating table, she focused on taking slow, deep breaths. The anesthesiologist placed a mask over her face and instructed her to count backward from 10. By the time she reached 7, her eyelids grew heavy, and the world around her faded into darkness. When she woke up, groggy and disoriented, the first thing she noticed was the absence of pain. Not just the sharp, stabbing kind she'd grown accustomed to, but even the dull ache that had become such a constant presence in her life. For the first time in years, her throat felt clear. It was surreal, almost unbelievable. Was this real, or was it just the lingering effects of the anesthesia clouding her senses? A nurse appeared beside her, offering a reassuring smile. "How are you feeling?" she asked softly. She tried to speak but found her voice hoarse and weak, which wasn't surprising given the circumstances. Still, she managed to croak out a single word. "Better." The nurse nodded knowingly. "That's normal after surgery. Your throat needs time to heal, but you're on the right track." They monitored her for a while longer, checking her vitals and making sure she was stable enough to go home. When the doctor finally came in to see her, his expression was encouraging. "Everything went smoothly," he told her. "We removed the growth successfully. You should start noticing improvements soon, though full recovery will take a bit of time." Hearing those words filled her with gratitude and relief so profound it nearly brought tears to her eyes. By the time her partner arrived to take her home, she was exhausted but hopeful. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would still be discomfort, restrictions, and moments of frustration, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was moving in the right direction. As they drove away from the hospital, sunlight streaming through the car windows, she allowed herself to imagine what life might look like without the weight of chronic pain holding her back. It was a fragile hope, yes, but one worth holding on to tightly. The first few days at home were a mix of rest, recovery, and readjustment. She had been warned that the initial phase wouldn't be completely pain-free. Her throat was still healing after all. But even so, the difference was astonishing. Gone was the relentless ache that had haunted her for years. Instead, there was only a mild soreness, the kind you might feel after shouting at a concert or talking too much. It was manageable, temporary, and most importantly, it wasn't constant. For someone who had lived with unrelenting discomfort for so long, this newfound clarity felt almost miraculous. Her partner took on the role of caretaker, making sure she stayed hydrated and comfortable. He brought her cups of warm water with honey, helped her adjust the pillows so she could sleep upright, and kept the house quiet to give her space to rest. At first she felt guilty about needing so much help, but he brushed off her concerns with a smile. "You've been through enough," he said firmly. "Let me do this for you." His support meant the world to her, not just because it made things easier physically, but because it reminded her how far they'd come together. There had been times when her pain had strained their relationship, moments when frustration boiled over into arguments. Now, though, they were united in hope, working as a team toward her recovery. As the days passed, small victories began to pile up. On the third day, she managed to eat a spoonful of soup without wincing, a tiny triumph perhaps, but one that left her smiling. By the fifth day, she was able to talk in short sentences without her voice cracking or fading away. Each milestone felt like reclaiming a piece of herself, like stepping closer to the person she used to be before the sore throat took over her life. Friends and family called regularly to check on her progress, their voices filled with genuine concern and excitement. "How's your throat?" became the universal greeting, and she found herself answering with growing optimism. "Better," she'd say. And for once it wasn't a lie. But recovery wasn't without its challenges. There were moments when doubt crept back in, whispering questions she tried hard to ignore. What if the pain returned? What if the surgery hadn't fixed everything? These thoughts would hit her late at night when the house was quiet and her mind refused to settle. She'd stare at the ceiling, replaying every detail of the doctor's explanation, searching for reassurance. But then she'd remind herself of the facts. The growth was gone, the procedure had gone smoothly, and the doctor had promised improvement. And deep down, she knew the proof was in the way she felt. Not perfect yet, but undeniably better. One afternoon, about a week after the surgery, she decided to take a short walk around the neighborhood. Her partner insisted on coming along, hovering nearby in case she needed anything, but she waved him off with a laugh. "I'm fine," she said, testing out her voice as she spoke. To her delight, it held steady. The air outside was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves. As she strolled down the familiar streets, she noticed details she hadn't paid attention to in years. The sound of birds chirping, the laughter of children playing in a nearby park, the gentle rustle of wind through the trees. It struck her, suddenly, how much she'd missed these simple joys while trapped in her own private storm of pain. That evening, as she sat on the couch flipping through channels, she realized something profound. She no longer dreaded tomorrow. For so long, each new day had been a battle, another 24 hours to endure until the next round of tests, treatments, or disappointments. Now, though, the future didn't seem quite so daunting. Sure, there were still hurdles ahead. More weeks of healing, follow-up appointments, and adjustments to her routine, but none of that felt insurmountable anymore. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to dream about what life might look like without the shadow of chronic pain hanging over her. She thought about all the things she wanted to do now that she could finally imagine doing them without fear of triggering her symptoms. Singing along to her favorite songs, for instance, a habit she'd abandoned years ago because it always left her throat raw. Or going out for coffee with friends, chatting freely without worrying about losing her voice halfway through the conversation. Even little things like reading bedtime stories to her nieces and nephews suddenly seemed possible again. These weren't grand ambitions by any means, but they represented a return to normalcy, a chance to live life fully instead of merely surviving it. By the end of the second week, her confidence grew stronger. She started experimenting with speaking, more testing the limits of her voice carefully. One morning, she stood in front of the mirror and sang a few lines from an old song she loved. Her voice cracked at first, but she pushed through, determined to see how far she could go. When she finished, tears welled up in her eyes, not from sadness, but from joy. It was such a small act, singing a few notes, but it symbolized something huge: freedom. Freedom from the grip of pain that had controlled her life for so long. Her follow-up appointment was scheduled for the following week, and she couldn't wait to share her progress with the doctor. She wanted to thank him, not just for performing the surgery, but for listening to her story when so many others hadn't, for taking the time to dig deeper, to look beyond the surface and find answers where others had stopped looking. As she prepared for the visit, she reflected on the journey she'd been on, the years of frustration, the endless searches for relief, and the moment she finally found hope. It had been a long, difficult road, but she was starting to see light at the end of the tunnel, and for the first time in ages she believed that light wasn't going to fade. The day of the follow-up appointment arrived, and she felt a mix of excitement and nerves. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, a chance to hear from the doctor whether her recovery was on track or if there were still hurdles to overcome. She dressed comfortably, choosing soft fabrics that wouldn't irritate her healing throat, and made sure to bring along a notebook. She wanted to write down everything he said, not trusting herself to remember every detail in the haze of emotions she knew would come. When she walked into the clinic, the receptionist greeted her with a warm smile, recognizing her from the previous visits. "How are you feeling?" the woman asked kindly. For once, she didn't hesitate before answering. "Better," she replied, her voice steady and clear. The word felt good leaving her lips, solid, true, and full of meaning. It wasn't just an answer, it was a declaration. Things were finally moving in the right direction. The nurse led her back to the same consultation room where she'd first learned about the growth in her throat. Sitting there now, she couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed since that day. Back then, she'd been overwhelmed by fear and uncertainty, unsure if anyone could truly help her. Now, though, she sat with a quiet confidence, knowing she was closer to reclaiming her life than ever before. The doctor entered the room moments later, his expression calm and professional as always. He glanced over her chart briefly before turning his attention to her. "How have you been doing?" he asked, leaning forward slightly as if to emphasize his interest. She took a deep breath and began sharing her progress. The small victories, the lingering soreness that was slowly fading, and the sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. As she spoke, she noticed him nodding thoughtfully, his eyes focused intently on hers. When she finished, he smiled. "That's wonderful to hear," he said warmly. "Based on what you're describing, it sounds like you're healing exactly as we hoped." He went on to explain that the mild discomfort she was experiencing was perfectly normal after surgery and would likely continue improving over the next few weeks. "Your body has been through a lot," he added gently. "Give it time to fully recover." He then conducted a quick examination, using a small light to check her throat. She braced herself for any unexpected news, but his expression remained reassuring throughout. "Everything looks good," he confirmed. "The area is healing nicely and there's no sign of complications. You're doing great." Hearing those words brought an overwhelming wave of relief. She hadn't realized how much she'd been holding on to until that moment when the tension finally melted away. After the exam, they discussed the road ahead. He reminded her to continue taking it easy for another week or two, avoiding anything that might strain her throat. Singing loudly, shouting, or even talking too much could slow down her recovery, so moderation was key. He also scheduled one final follow-up appointment in a month's time, just to ensure everything was progressing as expected. By then, he assured her, she should feel almost completely back to normal. As the appointment came to a close, she felt compelled to express her gratitude. "Thank you," she said earnestly, meeting his gaze. "Not just for the surgery, but for believing me when I said something was wrong. So many others didn't." Her voice cracked slightly, not from physical pain but from emotion. The weight of all she'd endured, the endless tests, the dismissive diagnoses, the years of living in doubt, suddenly bubbled to the surface. The doctor listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. "I'm glad we could figure this out together," he replied. "You never gave up even when things seemed impossible. That determination played a big part in getting you here." His words struck a chord deep within her. She realized how much strength she'd mustered during those dark days, how hard she'd fought to find answers when everyone else seemed ready to give up. It wasn't just the surgery or the doctor's expertise that had brought her this far. It was her own resilience, her refusal to let the pain define her forever. Walking out of the clinic, she felt lighter, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. The air outside was crisp and fresh, carrying the promise of new beginnings. She paused for a moment, closing her eyes and breathing deeply. Each inhale and exhale felt effortless, a luxury she hadn't experienced in years. Opening her eyes, she noticed the vibrant colors of autumn leaves scattered across the ground, their hues more vivid than she remembered. Everything around her seemed sharper, brighter, as if the world itself had shifted to reflect the clarity she now felt inside. Later, that evening, as she sat on the couch with her partner, she found herself reflecting on the journey she'd been through. She recounted every twist and turn, the frustration of unanswered questions, the exhaustion of countless failed treatments, and the sheer willpower it took to keep searching for help. But most of all, she thought about the lessons she'd learned along the way. Patience, perseverance, and trust in herself had carried her through when nothing else seemed to work. And while she wouldn't wish such a struggle on anyone, she couldn't deny that it had changed her in profound ways. Her partner listened quietly, holding her hand as she spoke. When she finished, he squeezed her fingers gently. "You're stronger than you think," he said simply. She nodded, knowing he was right. The past few years had tested her limits, but they had also revealed a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She wasn't the same person who had walked into that clinic months ago desperate for answers. She was someone new, someone who understood the value of hope, the importance of advocacy, and the power of never giving up. That night, as she drifted off to sleep, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. The battle wasn't completely over yet. There was still healing to be done, but the hardest part was behind her. For the first time in a long time, she fell asleep without dreading what tomorrow might bring. Instead, she dreamed of laughter, song, and conversations that flowed effortlessly. These dreams weren't fantasies anymore, they were possibilities waiting just around the corner. As the weeks passed, her recovery continued to unfold in ways that felt almost magical. The soreness in her throat faded further with each passing day, replaced by a sense of normalcy she had almost forgotten existed. Simple pleasures, things she once took for granted, began to return to her life one small step at a time. She marveled at how something as ordinary as swallowing water could feel so effortless now, how the act of speaking didn't leave her throat feeling raw or strained. It was like rediscovering pieces of herself she thought were lost forever. One evening, she decided to test her voice again. Standing alone in her living room, she picked out an old favorite song on her phone and pressed play. As the music filled the room, she closed her eyes and let the melody wash over her. Then, softly at first, she began to sing along. Her voice wavered slightly, still regaining its strength, but it held steady enough to carry the tune. By the second verse, she grew bolder, her confidence building with every note. When the song ended, she opened her eyes and caught sight of herself in the mirror across the room. A wide smile spread across her face, and tears welled up in her eyes, not from sadness but from sheer joy. Singing had always been one of her greatest loves, and now it was hers again. Her partner walked in just then, drawn by the sound of her voice. "Wow," he said, grinning. "That was beautiful." She laughed, feeling a warmth rise in her chest. For years, she'd avoided singing altogether, afraid of how it might irritate her throat. Now, though, she realized she didn't have to hold back anymore. That realization sparked something inside her, a desire to embrace all the things she'd been too scared to try during her long battle with pain. Over the next few days, she started venturing beyond her comfort zone. She called friends she hadn't spoken to in months, apologizing for being distant and explaining what she'd been through. To her surprise, they were understanding and supportive, eager to catch up and celebrate her progress. One afternoon, she met a close friend for coffee, their first outing together in ages. They sat in a cozy cafe, sipping lattes and chatting about everything under the sun. For hours, she talked freely without worrying about her voice giving out or her throat tightening up. When they finally parted ways, her friend hugged her tightly. "You seem lighter," she said. "Like you're finally back." The transformation wasn't just external, it ran deep within her. She noticed changes in her mindset, too. Before, she'd approached life cautiously, always bracing herself for the next wave of pain or disappointment. Now, though, she found herself leaning into moments of happiness, savoring them fully instead of waiting for the other shoe to drop. Little things brought her immense joy: a child's laughter at the park, the smell of freshly baked bread wafting from a bakery, the golden glow of sunlight streaming through her window in the morning. These weren't fleeting distractions anymore. They were reminders of how precious life could be when lived without constant discomfort. She also became more aware of her body in ways she never had before. During her years of suffering, she'd grown disconnected from herself, focusing only on the pain and trying to ignore everything else. But now, as her health improved, she started paying attention to how her body responded to different activities. Walking longer distances left her energized rather than drained. Eating nourishing meals made her feel strong and grounded. Even simple stretches in the morning helped loosen tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. It was as if reconnecting with her physical self allowed her to reconnect with her spirit too. One Saturday morning, she woke up early and decided to tackle a project she'd put off for years: cleaning out her closet. As she sorted through piles of clothes, she came across items she hadn't worn in ages: dresses she used to love, scarves she'd forgotten about, shoes tucked away in the back. Each piece carried memories of who she used to be before chronic pain took over her life. Holding them in her hands, she felt a pang of nostalgia, but also excitement. Maybe it was time to start wearing those dresses again, to step back into the version of herself she'd missed so much. By the end of the day, her closet looked completely transformed, organized, and refreshed. But more importantly, so did she. She stood in front of the mirror, trying on an old dress she hadn't worn in years. It fit perfectly, hugging her curves in all the right places. Smiling at her reflection, she realized something profound. She wasn't just healing physically, she was reclaiming her identity. Chronic pain had stolen so much from her, not just her comfort, but her confidence, her independence, and her sense of self-worth. Now, though, she was piecing it all back together, bit by bit. That night, she wrote in a journal for the first time in months. Writing had always been a form of therapy for her, a way to process emotions when words felt too heavy to say aloud. On the page, she poured out her heart, describing every emotion she'd experienced over the past few months, from the darkest days of despair to the brightest moments of hope. She wrote about the lessons she'd learned, the gratitude she felt, and the dreams she dared to dream again. By the time she finished, her hand ached from gripping the pen, but her heart felt lighter than ever. As she closed the journal and placed it on her nightstand, she reflected on how far she'd come. The journey hadn't been easy. It had tested her patience, her faith, and her resilience. But it had also taught her invaluable truths: that perseverance can lead to breakthroughs, that seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness, and that sometimes the hardest battles yield the sweetest victories. She climbed into bed that night with a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, yes, but she was ready to face them head-on. For the first time in a long time, she truly believed in the possibility of a brighter future. The final follow-up appointment arrived, and she walked into the clinic with a spring in her step. This time, there was no anxiety gnawing at her stomach, no lingering doubts clouding her mind. She felt confident, almost giddy, as she checked in at the reception desk. The staff greeted her warmly, their smiles reflecting the progress they'd witnessed over the past few months. "You look great," one of them said cheerfully, and for once, she didn't hesitate to agree. She did feel great, better than she had in years. When the doctor entered the consultation room, his expression mirrored the same calm assurance he'd shown throughout her journey. He glanced over her chart briefly before turning his attention to her. "How are you feeling?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. She grinned, unable to contain her excitement. "I feel amazing," she replied, her voice strong and clear. It was such a simple statement, yet it carried so much weight. After years of struggling to articulate her pain, being able to declare her health so confidently felt like a victory in itself. The doctor conducted a final examination, checking her throat one last time to ensure everything was healing properly. As he worked, she found herself reflecting on how far she'd come since that first meeting. Back then, she'd been desperate, unsure if anyone would ever take her seriously or find answers to her suffering. Now, sitting here healthy and hopeful, she realized what a monumental difference persistence and finding the right person could make. When he finished the exam, he sat back with a satisfied nod. "Everything looks perfect," he said. "You're healed." Those words hit her like a wave, washing away any lingering fears or doubts. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, tears welling up in her eyes. For so long she'd wondered if she'd ever hear those words, if she'd ever be free from the constant ache that had defined her life. And now here she was, finally released from its grip. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I can't even begin to tell you what this means to me." The doctor smiled kindly, his demeanor as warm and steady as it had always been. "You did the hard work," he said. "You never gave up, even when things seemed impossible. That determination is what brought you here." His words resonated deeply, reminding her of the countless times she'd wanted to quit but pushed forward anyway. She thought about all the sleepless nights, the endless rounds of tests, and the moments when hope had flickered dangerously low, yet through it all she'd kept fighting, for her health, for her happiness, and for the chance to live life fully again. As she left the clinic, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for the doctor who had solved the mystery, but for everyone who had supported her along the way. Her partner, who had stood by her side through every high and low. Her friends who had listened patiently and reminded her she wasn't alone. Even strangers whose stories of resilience had inspired her to keep going when she felt like giving up. They had all played a part in helping her reach this moment, and she vowed never to forget that. Walking outside, she paused to soak in the fresh air and sunshine. The world seemed brighter somehow, more vibrant than she remembered. She noticed details she might have overlooked before. The sound of birds chirping, the laughter of children playing nearby, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. These small joys, once overshadowed by pain, now felt like gifts she was determined to cherish. Life, she realized, wasn't meant to be endured, it was meant to be lived fully and freely. Over the following weeks, she embraced her newfound freedom with enthusiasm. She started attending social gatherings again, laughing and talking without worrying about her throat tightening or her voice fading. She joined a local book club, something she'd always wanted to do but never pursued because speaking for long periods had been too exhausting. At home, she rediscovered hobbies she'd abandoned during her illness: painting, gardening, baking, all activities that brought her joy and helped her reconnect with herself. One evening, while scrolling through social media, she stumbled across a post from someone sharing their struggle with chronic pain. The writer described feelings of frustration and isolation, emotions she knew all too well. Moved by the post, she decided to respond, sharing snippets of her own journey and offering words of encouragement. "It's not easy," she wrote, "but don't give up. Keep searching for answers and don't be afraid to advocate for yourself. There's hope even when it feels like there isn't." Her message received dozens of replies, many thanking her for her honesty and advice. One response stood out. "Reading your story gives me strength," the person wrote. "I needed to hear this today." Those words filled her with purpose. If her experience could inspire even one person to keep pushing forward, then everything she'd endured would be worth it. She realized that her battle hadn't just changed her life, it had given her an opportunity to help others facing similar struggles. Looking ahead, she made a promise to herself: to never take her health for granted again. Chronic pain had taught her how fragile life could be, but it had also shown her how resilient she was capable of being. She resolved to prioritize self-care, listen to her body, and celebrate every milestone, big or small. More importantly, she vowed to live each day with intention, savoring the moments that made life beautiful. Now, as she stood on the other side of her journey, she understood that healing wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about rediscovering who you were and embracing the possibilities of who you could become. The road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but she faced it with courage, knowing she had already overcome the hardest part. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive and ready to embrace whatever came next.